A dino star is born.
Turn the light off. Turn the light off.
In the summer of 1993, dinosaurs and paleontologists exploded onto movie screens around the world. Adapted from the 1990 Michael Crichton novel, Jurassic Park made instant stars and villains of several little-known species, with names such as Velociraptor and Dilophosaurus joining Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops in the public lexicon. But while the dinosaurs of action movies are typically not the animals that scientists know from nature, one of the elements that made the Jurassic Park franchise so successful was its reliance on the state-of-the-art in paleontology and genetics. Crichton and director Steven Spielberg brought modern dinosaur science to audiences for the first time, and the image they portrayed of active, intelligent animals still resonates today. Of course, Crichton and Spielberg took artistic liberties to tell a compelling story, dramatizing not only the scientists, but also the dinosaurs. The animal that departed most from the fossil evidence was Dilophosaurus. In the movie, it takes the form of a golden retriever-sized creature with a rattling frill and venomous spit that kills the computer programmer turned embryo smuggler Dennis Nedry. But in the nearly 3 decades since Dilophosaurus got the Hollywood treatment, researchers have recovered significant new fossil specimens and analyzed all of the remains with increasingly sophisticated methods. Scientists can now reconstruct this dinosaur in remarkable detail, including its appearance and behavior, how it evolved, and the world it inhabited. The findings show that the real Dilophosaurus bore little resemblance to its big-screen counterpart, while providing the most detailed portrait yet of a dinosaur from early in the Jurassic period. Today, we know Dilophosaurus as a bipedal meat-eating dinosaur, more than 20 feet long, with 2 distinctive parallel crests of very thin bone along the top of its head. In fact, its name derives from the Greek words for two-crested reptile. But in 1954, when the animal first appeared in the scientific literature, it had a different name. The crests had not been identified among the fragmentary remains, and paleontologist Samuel Wells called the creature Megalosaurus weatherili, believing it to be a new species in the previously known genus Megalosaurus. When Wells found an additional specimen in 1964 with the dual crests on the top of the skull preserved, he realized that the original find represented a new genus, so he renamed the animal Dilophosaurus weatherili. The basic body plan of the dinosaur in Jurassic Park was patterned on Wells' updated anatomical description and on artwork in the 1988 book Predatory Dinosaurs of the World. But the Jurassic Park Dilophosaurus departed from the scientific record of the time in several key details. Most obviously, it was depicted as being much smaller. The filmmakers did this deliberately to avoid any confusion with the Velociraptor. But they also added other fictional traits for dramatic effect. When writing the story, Crichton's Dilophosaurus could spit a blinding venom, much like some species of cobras today. Inspiration for the frill, meanwhile, came from the modern-day agamid lizard that lives in Australia and New Guinea. No evidence of such traits have turned up in the fossil record of Dilophosaurus, but since these embellishments resembled the biology of actual animals, they were believable. Artistic choices aside, other aspects of Jurassic Park drew from the latest science. In the lead-up to the book and film, paleontologists were just starting to reach broad agreement that modern birds descended from dinosaurs and are, in fact, their last surviving lineage. Following the recommendations from their science advisor, dinosaur paleontologist Jack Horner, the filmmakers decided to make the animals more bird-like in their movements. With the film's depiction of dinosaurs as quick, clever animals rather than the sluggish, more lizard-like creatures that 19th century scholars thought them to be, it was the first time many members of the general public encountered the bird-dinosaur connection. Other areas of the field of paleontology were also undergoing tremendous change at the time. Advances in computing were revolutionizing the study of fossils, enabling researchers to process enormous data sets in ways unimaginable when Dilophosaurus was first discovered. Take, for instance, cladistic analysis, which identifies discrete, heritable anatomical features that can be compared between animals and that provide a statistical basis for testing hypotheses about the relationships of animals to one another. Researchers can now analyze many more of these characteristics faster than ever before and develop better supported hypotheses about how dinosaurs were related and how they evolved. Increased computing power and developments in medical and industrial CT scanning also created a non-destructive way to look inside bones and rock for hidden anatomy. Not only did the analytical tools available to paleontologists evolve, but in 1998, teams at the University of Texas at Austin began recovering more Dilophosaurus remains in the same region of northern Arizona that yielded the first finds. Fossils are typically collected in large blocks of rock and encased in plaster to protect them during their journey from the field to the laboratory. When they arrive in the museum, paleontologists use dental picks, chisels, and miniature handheld jackhammers to carefully remove the rock and expose the fossils. After millions of years of exposure to geologic processes, such as crushing and weathering, the fossils are most often distorted and incomplete. Paleontologists sometimes disassemble and reconstruct broken fragments to better approximate their original condition, sculpting and adding missing material based on closely related animals. For instance, when Wan Langston Jr. and his colleagues prepared the first Dilophosaurus skeletons at the University of California, Berkeley in the 1950s, they filled in missing skull parts with casts from the skull of a more complete carnivorous dinosaur from the Jurassic, and they sculpted missing parts of the pelvis out of plaster. No one really knew what those missing parts looked like. The reconstructions represented a hypothesis of the real form of Dilophosaurus, one that could be tested with new fossils. When the new remains were found, a different picture of Dilophosaurus took shape. Initially, Wells interpreted some of the joints between the tooth-bearing bones at the end of the snout as weak and suggested that Dilophosaurus may have been a scavenger, or that it did most of its killing with claws on its hands and feet. The Dilophosaurus material discovered since shows that the animal's snout and jaw were much more substantial. The upper jaw bones do not have the weak interface that the fragmentary first finds suggested. Instead, these bones indicate a strong skull capable of biting into prey. Likewise, newly identified features of bones from the animal's lower jaw show stout ridges for muscle attachments. In modern reptiles, these ridges provide surface area for the attachment of large muscles. In the skeleton of a different dinosaur found at the UT Austin dig site, the plant-eating Ceratosaurus features bite marks, attesting to the presence of a large meat-eating animal with jaws strong enough to puncture bone. Together, this evidence supports the idea that Dilophosaurus was probably a predator with a deadly bite, rather than a creature that had to scavenge or use its claws to kill. The new fossils also confirmed that Dilophosaurus was a large dinosaur, especially for its time. Most of the dinosaurs of the late Triassic of western North America were animals the size of turkeys or eagles. But just 20 million years later, Dilophosaurus would have towered over a human, standing up to 8 feet tall and measuring up to 25 feet long when fully grown. It had much longer and stronger arms than other larger meat-eating dinosaurs, such as Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus, and its legs were relatively longer as well. When the first skeletons of Dilophosaurus were found, scientists thought the species was related to the so-called carnosaurs Allosaurus and Streptospondylus. So they reconstructed the missing parts of the pelvis to look like they did in those animals. The better preserved Dilophosaurus skeletons found later show a different pelvis anatomy. Like many early dinosaurs and all modern birds, Dilophosaurus had fleshy air pockets from its respiratory system growing into its vertebrae, which provided strength while simultaneously lightening the skeleton. These air sacs allowed for the unidirectional flow of air through the lungs. In other words, The entire cycle occurs in one breath, as it does in birds and crocodilians. This type of respiration provides the animal with more oxygen than does the bidirectional respiratory system that mammals have, in which air flows both in and out of the lungs. Animals that breathe unidirectionally tend to have a relatively high rate of metabolism, and thus high activity levels. So Dilophosaurus was probably a fast, agile hunter. CT imaging has revealed that these air sacs are also present in the bones surrounding the dinosaur's brain, and were continuous with the sinus cavities in the front of the skull. In most meat-eating dinosaurs, a ridge of bone provides a roof over an opening in the skull in front of the eye sockets, known as the antorbital fenestra. But in Dilophosaurus, this opening is continuous with the side of the dinosaur's unique crests, suggesting that the crests too had air sacs. The crests were almost certainly covered by keratin, the same material that forms horns, claws, and hair, and may have played a role in helping members of this species identify one another or attract mates. But how the air sacs might have supported these or other functions of the crests is unclear. One of the challenges of studying the evolutionary history of any species is understanding physical variation within and among taxonomic groups. Wells thought the various skeletons he categorized as Dilophosaurus actually represented multiple genera, but the latest cladistics tools show a different story. By identifying hundreds of anatomical features present on each individual skeleton and comparing them with one another, it seems that the animals are so similar that they must represent not only one genus, but one species. And by comparing the anatomical characteristics of Dilophosaurus with other specimens from around the world, the evolutionary gap between its closest known relatives appears to be significant, implying that many other, closer relatives remain to be discovered. Just as our conception of Dilophosaurus the animal has grown more detailed, so too has our understanding of the world it lived in. Traveling down into the northern Arizona quarry where Dilophosaurus was first found is a journey to the early Jurassic epoch. Back then, dinosaurs left footprints in what is now sandstone across the Colorado Plateau. The Red Rock Badlands spill out to the western horizon, where they meet the much younger volcanic peaks of Flagstaff, Arizona. To the northwest is the mouth of one of the world's most visited geologic features, the Grand Canyon. These landscapes preserve much of the past 1.8 billion years in rock, allowing paleontologists to use lines of geologic and biological evidence to reconstruct the environments of deep time. Studies of the rock in this area show that Dilophosaurus lived around 183 million years ago, plus or minus a few million years. Dilophosaurus therefore lived approximately 5 to 15 million years after the end Triassic mass extinction event, which resulted in the loss of roughly 3/4 of all life on Earth, including most of the large reptiles that competed for resources with the early dinosaurs. The mass extinction was probably triggered by the initial breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea as the northern Atlantic Ocean opened up like a volcanic zipper. Throughout the late Triassic and early Jurassic, the North American tectonic plate traveled northward from a subtropical climate belt into an arid climate belt, so the location where Dilophosaurus lived moved from the approximate latitude of modern-day Costa Rica to modern-day northern Mexico. As such, its environment was seasonally dry, with sand dunes migrating in and out of wetter environments where animals flourished. Fossils of other organisms found in the area reveal how Dilophosaurus fit into the ecosystem. It was the apex predator in the river oasis it inhabited, a conifer-lined waterway through a sea of sand. One specimen housed at UT Austin was found in the same quarry as two individuals of the long-necked herbivore Ceratosaurus. These dinosaurs lived alongside a smaller meat-eating dinosaur called Megapnosaurus, and a small armored dinosaur called Scutellosaurus. The most common animal found in the region is the early turtle Caeanticheles, which swam alongside heavily scaled bony fish, freshwater coelacanths, and lungfish. Early mammal relatives, including the beaver-like tritylodontids and rat-like morganucodontids, were also potential prey for Dilophosaurus. In the fossil excavation depicted in Jurassic Park, a complete velociraptor skeleton comes to light with some gentle brushing. But in the real world, dinosaur fossils are typically found as broken, barely identifiable fragments. On a lucky day, a mostly complete bone might turn up. It took decades to find the additional remains that filled in unknown anatomy, and successive generations of paleontologists to interpret the bones. But Dilophosaurus has now become the best documented early Jurassic dinosaur from anywhere in the world. This couldn't have happened without the vital role played by natural history museums. You might think of museums as dramatically lit spaces to show exhibits, but their major function is to conduct research into the natural world. To that end, these institutions build up large collections of specimens to serve as the evidence for scientific research. Teams of specially trained conservators, archivists, and collection managers carefully document and preserve the specimens, with the goal of making the collections accessible to researchers. Repeatability is a cornerstone principle of scientific research, and other scientists must be able to corroborate each other's findings. In paleontology, that means that the fossils themselves must be preserved in a museum, so that future generations of scientists can revisit the specimens and double-check observations. Sometimes this results in building on prior knowledge, and other times it means overturning old notions. It can be exciting when this hard-won information filters into pop culture, as it has going back to the dawn of animation. Winsor McCay's 1914 Gertie the Dinosaur opens with the animator and a group of friends visiting the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, looking at the skeleton of a sauropod dinosaur. McCay bets his party that he can bring the animal to life. The result is the first dinosaur to appear on film. McCay consulted with paleontologists at the museum for guidance on his reconstruction of Gertie. And the studio behind the 1954 Godzilla found inspiration for the design of its monster in the dinosaurs that appeared in a 1947 mural by Rudolf Zallinger entitled The Age of Reptiles, housed at the Yale Peabody Museum. Incidentally, the reverse is also true. Pop culture filters into science, sometimes literally. Langston once recounted that while repairing fossils at UC Berkeley in the 1930s and 1940s, the paleontologists would dissolve cellulose acetate film strips in acetone to make glue rather than buy more expensive cement. So yes, Dilophosaurus is in the movies. But perhaps there's a little bit of the movies in Dilophosaurus too. This video was adapted from the article The Real Dilophosaurus by Matthew A. Brown and Adam D. Marsh. It appeared in the DinoStar issue of Scientific American.